Well, good morning, all. This is the second of our coronavirus talks, and they are fun to prepare. I've been worked all weekend on this guy. Well, actually, worked all last week on it too. Um, the data is changing so fast; it's hard to keep up with everything. So let me get on and get the slides started here. The third and final topic I'll be talking about is how do we mitigate or reduce the C-19 quarantine's health impact and economic impact. The first two sections I'm gonna be doing is on C-19 itself, uh, then I'm gonna be doing the 1918 flu epidemic and how that impacted the world. So thank you for your attendance, and I thank you in advance for your questions. I always enjoy doing questions. We're going to have 53 slides this morning. The first 15 are going to be how C19 infects. The next 14 are going to be on the 1918 pandemic primarily, and the last 20 some slides are going to be on how we might reduce the cases and the economic impact. We know how to do one or the other, but we got to figure out a way to do both. And next week, my final talk is going to be basically it's going to be a combination of this book, Factfulness, which talks about the 10 instincts of why we get things wrong in life. And we're going to use COVID-19 as an example of how we get things wrong and based on those 10 things. So the three comment periods today is at the end of slide 15. On slide 15, we're going to end, my first 15 slides are graphically going to show how C19 flu infects the body, quasi-medical talk. The second 14 slides are going to be on the 1918 flu and its economic and health impacts. And the third slides, taking up to slide 53, will be mitigating the impacts from the C19's quarantine. So I'm going to start here with C19 explained in 9 slides from the visual capitalist. So obviously the lungs, and you've got the airway coming down in through the trachea, the bronchus, and into the air sacs. And this is an example of the air sacs. This is in your lung. The air is directed into these air sacs, and in the air sacs, you've got a very thin layer here between the air that's in here and the capillary that's going around the air sac that's picking up the oxygen and discharging the carbon dioxide. And this is a healthy lung, so oxygen comes in and carbon dioxide goes out, and you breathe out more carbon dioxide than you breathe in and less oxygen. So that's the way it works. Works great most of the time. So what happens? Well, C19 comes down through your enters your body through your nose or your mouth and goes down into the air sacs inside your lungs. And once in those air sacs, it makes copies of itself. The virus has little spikes on it. The spikes are actually fit into receptors on the cell. Every cell has little portals on it. And the virus is clever, and it makes a spike that fits into a portal on a cell. It then injects its DNA into that cell. It hijacks the cell's replication process for DNA or RNA, and it hijacks it completely and makes as many copies of the virus as it possibly can until the cell literally explodes. In which case the virus is now spread all over the place and all the adjacent cells get infected. And initially, a person is really not aware this is happening when you first get C19. So this shows it happening. This shows here it shows the C19 virus, and it shows the little spikes here, and they attach to the cell the cell wall. The air's come in here, attaches to the cell wall, and it hijacks the cell. And so what happens to the body? Well, the hijacked cells produce inflammation, which triggers an immune response. And that inflammation raises your temperature also and causes you to cough, dry cough, temperature. But what happens inside each of these little tiny air sacs is they now start to accumulate fluid, which makes both the dry cough and makes breathing more difficult. And for 80, 85, maybe even 90% of the people infected, these symptoms will just run the course the way the normal flu does. So what's happening is this shows that a series of cells, a series of air sacs that have become infected, and it shows them filling up with fluid. And the fluid makes it more difficult for the capillaries to pass the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. And it sends out a bunch of inflammatory signals, which causes the body's systems to react. And that actually can become a problem for some people. You know, most people get stung by a bee and they just, it's painful and they just have a reaction. But some people get stung by a bee and their body's inflammatory system overreacts, and it has a cytokine reaction. And it's actually not the poison from the bee sting that gets them seriously ill or kills them. It is their body's overreaction to it. Their immune system's overreaction to it. So that happens in some people. But anyhow, about 15 to 20% of the cases, the immune system's response creates what's called a cytokine storm. As I've just been saying, this runaway immune response can be more damaging than the virus itself. So the people who are young and otherwise in good conditions can sometimes have this. Not you know, it's the same kind of. There's not very many people get this kind of reaction, but it's the same kind of reaction you get to if you're allergic to bees or allergic to peanuts. So if enough of the air sacs collapse, you get acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. And this can cause you to get put on a ventilator. So this is when it starts to get severe. Your air sacs now filled up with a protein-rich solution that's got a lot of trash in it, and the trash is coating the walls, making it impossible for oxygen to go through or carbon dioxide to come out. And you are in trouble. The first solution is try to put you on oxygen, then on pressurized oxygen, and then on a ventilator. And then it can even get worse than that. You can get such a reaction that you start to get a septic reaction. Septic being a non-oxygen producing bacteria react, and it's a mess. You get shock and organ failure, multi-organ failure, particularly among older people and particularly with those with underlying medical conditions. So this is a rundown of the various responses going from 1 to 8, and you want to you don't want to go too far down that list. I guess technically pneumonia is starting as early as step 3 when fluid starts to be accumulating inside the air sacs, and then that's shortness of breath, which results in the hospitalization, which then can result in the ICU, which can then get more and more serious. So how do you tell if you got C19? Well, you can probably fever is the easiest. That's your immune system's reaction to the invasion of the virus. The loss of smell and taste is an interesting one because the virus enters through your mouth or nose, and therefore it's attacking those cells early on. And so you have a loss of smell and taste. And then both of those kind of result in a cough, fatigue, and then sometimes you get these other things. If you have both a loss of smell and taste and one of these other symptoms like a fever, you're about 3 times as likely to have C19, and you should self-isolate for 7 days, according to the professor that did this study. That's a quick presentation by a non-medical person as to what's happening. I hope it was a little bit informative and you can see a little how this is going to develop, because this then becomes important. How can we treat and how can we stop the quarantine earlier? So I'm open for questions if anybody has any. Does anybody have any questions about how this works and the testing methods?
Yes, Peter, we do have, the first question was to explain your background. So coming from your perspective, I know last time you said you are not a medical doctor. So just what's your background? What's your perspective and your background?
Okay, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an engineer, business MBA, business person, serial entrepreneur, having started a number of companies. And my most recent company is a company that I've been president of for the last 16 years, and that's attempting to use DNA to discover errant proteins in the blood to identify diseases which cause those errant proteins to be present and result in a rapid diagnostic of multiple different diseases. I'm not a medical doctor, and I certainly hope I'm not pretending to be one, but that's kind of the background. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. And another one asked, what is known about 3 mutations of COVID-19? I believe they are known as A, B, and C. Do we know any possible long-term damage to the lungs or other symptoms as a result of exposure to C19?
Well, I wasn't aware. I am very aware that the virus mutates. All viruses mutate, and this is always the danger. It's mutated from bats to whatever animal it went to next into humans. And it's mutated so that it can now pass human to human. There's other potential mutations. Viruses are known to do that. And I didn't realize they had identified it as an A, B, and C.
Do we know any possible long-term damage to the lungs or other symptoms as a result of exposure to C19?
Yeah, this is nasty. This is showing it well into its nasty stage. You've got scar tissue down here. You've got the whole cell wall coated. You've got a chemical called surfactant keeps the air cell open and blown up like a little balloon, and you've got this loss of surfactant. You've got a barrier of dead cells here that's preventing the oxygen and the carbon dioxide from going into the capillaries. Man, this can get bad. How many of these are can you recover from some or all of these? Yeah, but anytime you get scar tissue, you've got more of a problem. You need to ask a medical doctor for anything above and beyond what I can contribute. Thank you.
And kind of along with that line, is the body's reaction to C19 similar to how it reacts to a flu virus?
I believe so. Yes, as I understand it, yes, it is a similar reaction. an average of 36,000 people per year die of the flu in the US. So the flu is much more serious. I mean, 36,000 people is a lot of people. Compare that to the number that die from car accidents. That's a lot of people die from the flu. So yeah, the flu can get nasty too, and for the pretty much the same reasons. I'm going to go on to section 2,
Yeah.
which is the health and economic impact of the 1918 flu, incorrectly called the Spanish flu by some people, but not Spaniards. Anyhow, this is from CDC. This is a seasonal flu versus a pandemic flu. And so the big difference here is there's little immunity because there's no previous exposure to similar viruses. The normal flu doesn't change that much. It does mutate. All viruses mutate. It does mutate from year to year. But generally, this year's seasonal flu is going to be somewhat similar to last year's or the last couple years' flu. So the flu vaccine kind of aims at trying to develop antibodies for the last couple years' flu and hope that it works. And it works pretty well, 80% of the time. But a pandemic is caused when you get a brand new flu that there is no, your body has no antibodies for, and you don't, and your annual flu vaccine doesn't provide you with the signals that causes your body to make those antibodies. They happen fairly rarely. There's these are 4 dates that they apparently did happen, and I'd say there's probably about 3 pandemics per century. We are in a war with viruses and microbes, and it's a war that they're going to win. Kind of, you know, we hold our own, but they fight a mean war. And they spread on little moisture droplets. So when you cough, obviously, the virus has got to get out of your lungs in order to make someone else infected. So you do that by talking near a person or sneezing, and little droplets are coming out of your mouth. And of course, to a slightly lesser extent, even breathing. You're breathing in air. The air is getting more moist because your lungs are moist. It's picking up little aerosol water droplets, and the virus grabs onto that and goes back out when you exhale. There may be some reason that these little droplets may evaporate faster in warm, dry weather. It seems as though this virus survives best in survives best below 75 degrees Fahrenheit and dry. So one of the things I've done in my condo is I've increased the temperature. We're running it at 78 day round, and I was going to set it so that it dried out the air some more, but then after I read that, I decided that wouldn't be smart. So one of the reasons that in Florida we may be having a little bit less transmissibility of the flu is that sunlight, the UV from sunlight, kills the virus, scrambles its DNA. And the seasonal flu shot is really, as I said, was for last year's flu. So it's going to take them about 18 months is the best estimate. They're going to come up with a new vaccine. Now they might get a breakthrough and do it in 6 months, but I think the probability of that breakthrough is actually quite low. But if you've got to test the flu on an increasing number of people, it's got to go through a testing procedure. One of the early potentials for the C19 flu vaccine actually increased rather than decreased its spread. And the biggest danger that you get in a pandemic, where the reason it's so different than the traditional seasonal flu, is that a pandemic overwhelms the hospital care system, overwhelms the hospital care providers, overwhelms the hospitals. And so we expect to be, just if we get sick, to go to the hospital and be well taken care of. And when the system is overloaded and overwhelmed, you just aren't going to get the same level of care. If you can get into the hospital, you're not going to get the same level of care. And that's the big difference between a pandemic and a seasonal flu. And that is the one thing that you really got to try to prevent, is overwhelming the medical system. So who is really at risk here? Well, the people that are at risk are people with serious complications, even if they're under 60, and the elderly are at high risk. So last Friday, I got a hold of there's a draft paper from the Federal Reserve. New York's Federal Reserve has written a draft paper on pandemics. Naturally, the Federal Reserve System is concerned about the economic impacts as well as the health impacts. And so they wrote this paper, What Happened in 1918, and I found some interesting things in it that I want to share with you. So what they did is they had 43 cities listed there that they had quarantine data on, when the quarantine started, what the intensity of the quarantine, what the speed was, and I've taken that. I didn't take that. They plotted this out, and what they did is in the red dots they said that the quarantine was more lenient. They didn't. You can have a tight quarantine or an easy quarantine. I don't think I need to define that. It's just however it's enforced. I would say that we're voluntarily having a fairly tight quarantine, but it seems like the government isn't really enforcing it. So therefore, the government's level here, I would say, in Pinellas County is a bit on the lenient side. I'd say the people are more on the strict side. And then you get on the green dots on this, you get stricter quarantines. That is, cities that decided they were going to enforce the quarantine more heavily. They're using NPIs for non-pharmaceutical interventions. I think it's easier and more easy to explain. You just use the word quarantine. If I have drawn those ellipses correctly, it is clear that the green ellipse basically circles the more strict quarantines, had lower mortality, lower death rate, and a more rapid economic recovery. If you look at the stricter ones, or the more lenient ones, they had mortality rates all over the place, but they basically had probably a national average of economic recovery. And so what you pick up from this is, does a strict quarantine pay for itself economically as well as from a health standpoint? And from this, you would say yes. And then I said, well, but look at those cities that are up there in the upper area that recovered economically better. They're all sort of West Coast cities. And I wondered if the West Coast in 1918, 1919 wasn't just growing faster than the rest of the country, and therefore should be excluded from the standpoint of their economic recovery was faster. It was faster beforehand and was faster after, and therefore was not related to the stricter quarantine. In which case, if I take those cities out and redraw those, yes, even here, the stricter quarantine has a much lower mortality rate than the looser, lenient quarantine. But it may or may not have helped in the economic recovery. So I looked at those cities and said, okay, can I find anything in those cities that give me a little bit better idea? And so I took 4 upstate New York cities, 3 of which I've lived in. And I said, these 3 cities I know pretty well. They're all roughly the same size. They're all in a straight line east-west straight line across New York State, middle of New York State. Have here is when the first case happened. This next one is called the first death, but it's actually more when the death rate starts to double or the infection rate starts to double. I'm not exactly sure how they define that. And this is when the quarantine was initiated, and this is the number of days between this middle column and the when quarantine started. And this is someone's judgment as to the intensity that they enforced that quarantine. And these are the mortalities from in 1917 from flu and pneumonia. And these are the mortalities in 1918 from flu and pneumonia. And this is the percent increase in mortalities between those 2 years. So what you see here is Albany, Rochester, and Buffalo. The deaths from flu and pneumonia increased about 3.5 times in the 1918 flu epidemic. And you also see that Syracuse right here, their enforcement intensity is not as high as these other three. And that may explain why they had 4.5 times the number of deaths rather than 3. These are 3.5 times the number of deaths from the prior year. So I'm trying to take the data and see if I can get anything out of this preliminary data, and that's the best I could get. I read a book on pandemics, but it was too long to repeat, and I didn't pick up anything that I could pass on. So then I took from CDC, I took all of the estimated flu deaths by season in the United States for a 7-year period, starting in the 2010-2011 season up to the 2016-17 season, and CDC's estimates of the number who actually caught it. Nobody would know, but they would know this one, the number that actually took medical visits. They'd know that pretty well. And they'd know this number pretty well. This is the number that actually got hospitalized, and this is the number that died. And I averaged all of these, and I put the averages down here, and then divided by 330 million people. And I found that 7.6%, 76,000 per million, or 7.6% of the population came down with a flu on an average season. 3.6% of those had to go and see a medical doctor, chose to see a medical doctor. 1,200 per million actually got hospitalized, and about 1/10 of those actually died, 106 per million. I want you to remember these two numbers for a second because they're going to be important on the next slide. Now, in the 1918 flu, there were 5,340 deaths per million. I took the deaths by the population of that 1918. So the deaths were 50 times the death rate here. This is 106 per million. This is 5,300 per million, or 50 times the number of deaths in 1918 that we have on a current seasonal flu today. So what I got out of all of this comparing the 1918 to the current pandemic is I got in 1918, the cities who had more intense quarantine enforcement probably did reduce deaths. The intensity of the quarantine may have allowed faster economic recovery, but I can't say that based on the data that I looked at. And we're going into the roaring 20s. So actually, the economic recovery from the 1918 was fairly fast. And then why did the 1918 flu result in 50 times the average deaths today, but only 3 to 4 times the average number of flu deaths of 2017? I mean, it was considered a horrible epidemic, but it was only 3 to 4 times the average from what the average death rates from flu and pneumonia in 1917.
Peter, yes, there is a question. It says, when you get to the economic impact discussion, could you say a word about the risk of systemic bankruptcy, the situation where people and companies systemically are unable to pay one another? Professor Stiglitz wrote a paper about this matter in 2018, but our laws and social policy to not encompass a remedy of the collapse of the entire real economy or large section of it.
That is such a great question. That is so perfect for section 3 of my talk, and so perfect for the ongoing debate I'm having with one of the medical doctors in ASPEC. We have quite a few medical doctors, retired medical doctors in ASPEC. Most of them are tolerating my thought process on this, and recognizing that the economic impacts could be serious and have to be included. One of the medical doctors is, I would say, 100% strictly enforced quarantine, no let off on it, and that's the way to handle this. And so I'm about to say a lot about that. So thank you for your question. I see, Winslow, you're raising your hand here.
Hey, I have an article that was I found on the internet that talked about comparing two cities during the 1918 pandemic. They compared Philadelphia and St. Louis. And basically Philly just said, hey, the heck with it, we're gonna have a parade. And they stuffed a lot of people there. And St. Louis said, no, we're gonna do social distancing. Well, the upshot was that they cut the deaths down by half, basically. A different story played out in St. Louis, just 900 miles away. Within 2 days of detecting its first cases among civilians, the city closed schools, playgrounds, libraries, courtrooms, even churches. Work shifts were staggered and streetcar ridership was strictly limited. Public gatherings of more than 20 people were banned. And so basically it said, the extreme measures now known as social distancing, which have been called by global health authorities to mitigate the spread, kept per capita flu-related deaths in St. Louis to less than half of those in Philadelphia, according to this paper.
Well, yes, I've read, thank you, and I've read that paper, and there is certainly validity. I mean, you can't fight the fact that there's 1/2 of the people, they had 1/2 the number of people per million die. But here's St. Louis, and what you see is the first case was reported on October 2nd. On October 16th, this doubling effect triggered, and on October 17th, they went into a quarantine, which was only 1 day after it doubled. But they had the big advantage of all the soldiers were coming back on troop ships, not airplanes. They're coming back on troop ships, and they were all landing in New York and Philadelphia and all the port cities. And if they had gotten sick on board ship, if they were sick when they got on the ship or on board ship, naturally they were treated in the hospital systems in New York and Philadelphia. So those cities are the ones that are going to show a lot of issues and a lot of spread. The ones that were healthy or healthier or hadn't come down on the ship were the ones that could then take the trains to get all the way to St. Louis. You couldn't get there. You couldn't fly there the way you can today. Therefore, St. Louis experienced the first cases later than Philadelphia. And yes, they took action more rapidly, but they took action more rapidly because they could see from the eastern cities the advantages of taking a quarantine reaction. And yeah, over here you see 425 deaths per million or per 100,000 in, was it Philadelphia? Philadelphia was, if I'm doing this right, Philadelphia was either 900 or 1,200. Yeah, that's all true, but there are ways to explain that this wasn't. There's an awful lot of other city pairs you could have looked at. That's why I looked at the 4-city pairs in upstate New York. I figured they were non-port cities, a little bit more relevant to each other. And basically they all had about the same action. Winslow, we don't know, but
I know.
yeah, people that are supporting 100% quarantine forever point that as an example of why it is important to quarantine forever.
Yeah, and I suppose today we should compare Seattle and LA versus New York. But I'll hang up.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So if there's no more questions, I'm going on to section 3. Is it possible to mitigate C-19's both the health impacts and the economic impacts with a shorter quarantine? And so here is the job loss. And this is a 4-week average, so you're really not picking up what's happening here, but it has jumped to a record high in March. And what you see is it's much higher than in the 2008 financial crisis, and it's more like back here in 83 and 74, but it exceeds those levels too. And it's just starting. So we've got a real unemployment problem, losses in the millions. I think I saw 10 million, 11 million. And what's happened to the world's health? Well, this is the major markets, major stock markets of the world, and you see them all down from 10 to 30%. And you see the US, while it has recovered, it was down as low as 35%. It's now been down to 17%. But you see the world's wealth disappearing. And I doubt too many of us are concerned about the top 10, the wealth of the top 10 richest people, but they did lose $125 billion in the month of March. I'm sure they got plenty to buy coffee, but it's a disappearance of wealth that has an impact on one's spending ability. And this is a series of, I found this one, a bunch of economic experts, and basically over 90, maybe 95% of them agree that there'll be a very large contraction in economic activity until the spread drops. So when is the spread going to drop? And how can we reduce this? So I want to talk about 2 methods that we could do to reduce this, the health impact and the economic impact. One is we could do, well, to reduce the health impact, you can do immunity by vaccination, but it looks like the best guess is September 2000, next year, 2021. You could do a preventative drug, a drug that keeps you, even if you have been exposed to it, you don't pick it up. That's years in the making. A normal drug takes 12 years to get through FDA approval. You could lower the risk of, once somebody catches it, by taking a therapeutic drug that, or therapeutic treatment, and that's probably years. Maybe this malaria drug will help on those people whose immune system goes haywire, but it's not going to help everybody. You could quarantine all the infected people. This would be how it was done in the plague in the 1600s, big red X on the door. You could quarantine everybody at high risk, which is a Swedish method. Or you could do what almost all the rest of the countries in the world are doing, which is quarantining everybody. And these are some of the possible ways you could reduce this impact medically. Well, how can we reduce this impact economically? Well, we could stimulate the economy by doing helicopter money, and that's sort of what the $1,200 per person about to be released next week, checks mailed and direct deposited into your checking account. You could stimulate demand by starting government projects. They tend to be infrastructure projects, roads, water, sewer, new buildings. You could quarantine as few as possible, and keep as few as is safe but you'd keep the daycares, the schools, and the businesses open to some extent, a reduced extent, but to some extent. That's Sweden's approach. And what are we trying to do here? Well, we're trying to do what everybody refers to as flatten the curve. And I showed this last week. This is the number of cases that occur. This is time, and this is the number of cases, and this is without a quarantine. It spreads rapidly, results in a whole bunch of cases rapidly, and while those cases eventually do drop off, the problem here is that you've overwhelmed the healthcare system. You've exceeded the capacity of the hospitals and the healthcare providers to provide healthcare. And furthermore, it's even worse than that because you see a gradual decline in the ability of the hospitals and the healthcare to handle people because they themselves are getting sick or under quarantine. So everybody wants to take this curve and push it down to this curve, which is called flattening the curve, which is slowing the rate of infection, which is done by social distancing and quarantining, and a whole bunch of different things can do this. The quarantining seems to be the favorite of the world. Sweden is also doing this without 100% quarantining, and we're going to talk about that, and both from a health standpoint and from an economic standpoint. So this is the rate that the virus seems to increase if you don't without quarantine. It increases the rate of about 33% per day until you run out of new patients, new people. But South Korea pushed it down, Japan pushed it down, Singapore and Hong Kong all pushed these rates down. And China, of course, when it got serious, they pushed it down. And here's in the US, I put this table together first back in March 15th. And by an increase of March 16th, there were 4,000 cases on that day, and I increased it by 33% every day. And this is how the United States would have developed had there been no quarantining, no social distancing, nothing. And what you see is up to the end of March, it's actually following this curve pretty well because we weren't doing much in the way of social distancing. This curve would have projected 133,000, and there was really 123,000. Well, then the people started to get more serious about self-quarantining and social distancing. And by April 2nd, it was at half the rate that would have projected. And then by the 7th, it was way down. There were 400. I mean, it's still increasing. These are not good numbers, but relative to what it could have been if we had not taken any action. And as of yesterday, there would have been 10 million people infected had we not done any quarantining or social distancing or the stuff we did. And instead, we had a little over 500,000. So we're about 5.6% of what we would have been. This shows the quarantining. This shows the spread by Columbia researchers, epidemiologists, who looked at what would have happened had we not had any quarantining. And what you see is a fairly rapid spread, including here in Pinellas. About 25% of us would have been infected by May 1st and pushing 75% by June 1st and so on. And you know, by August, everybody has been at least exposed to and probably been infected. This is what the same epidemiologists at Columbia calculated if you had a strong, good quarantine. And what they say is by, you know, April 1st would have been about what we experienced. By May the 1st, we wouldn't have gotten a lot. And even by August 1st, we're less than 25% of us been exposed. Well, this is great. This is really good. This keeps the hospital system and the health providers from being overwhelmed But look at what it does to the curve back here. It pushes, instead of the quarantine being over here, when you exceed when you get back down under the health capacity, it requires the quarantine to continue to go on, because if you were to let off the, if here you were able to stop the quarantine, what you would expect is an immediate spike up into here. And you cannot let that happen. So that's the kind of the game we're playing here. So this was an interesting one. This is from this is a bunch of quasi experts all projecting when they think the quarantine will end, and the average projection was 8.4 weeks, which would be right here. It would be June 7th. I doubt it. I seriously doubt it at the way it's going right now. I don't think it'll end that quickly. So then the New York Times had an interesting article in it. Before they got a bunch of experts together and said, well, what requirements are there to end a regional quarantine? And they kind of came up with 4 requirements. 14 days of reduced number of cases in that area. So it would be Pinellas County or Pinellas, Tampa Bay probably as one region. 14 consecutive days of reducing the number of cases, and that those number of cases are well within what the hospital and healthcare system can handle. Then you could consider reducing the quarantine. You have to make sure that the hospitals and health staff can handle everybody. That is, the discharges are greater than the new admissions. You have to be able to test everybody who has symptoms. And in order to do that, we need about 750,000 tests per week. And we don't yet have that capacity. We're approaching it. It doesn't say test everybody. It says you got to test everybody with symptoms. And that's starting to get up. We're almost getting up there. And then you have to be able to monitor confirmed cases and their contacts so that you prevent the continuous spread. If you can do all 4 of those things, you can end a quarantine. So looked at this and plotted this I didn't plot it, I pulled this graph off from last night. This is through last night, the number of new cases in the United States. Now, so here in the United States, it looks like we may have peaked, and actually you can read into this that we peaked and we're actually starting to come down. I think that's pushing the data a little bit, but you could read that if you want to be an optimist. But it's not on United States. You've got to actually have this curve for each regional area. I would say probably the Tampa, St. Petersburg area ought to be considered one area. Orlando, one area. Miami, one area. And you ought to look at what's happening on their new cases in order to determine whether or not you can slow down the quarantine. Well, what if you take the approach that we're not going to stop the quarantine until this whole thing is over, which from my earlier graph there that shows an epidemiologist's projection of what's going to be happening in our area by August 1st, less than 25% of us will have been exposed, and 75% of us could still get the virus. And so we should maintain 100% quarantine until at least August 1st, and then we decide afterwards. Well, the problems is the quarantine is going to crater the economy, as one of the questions to put in. It's going to, and cratering an economy increases misery, pain, and death. In other words, there is a health effect to a cratering economy. Ask the people that lived through the Great Depression. There is a serious health impact from an economy that is not functioning. Unemployed people are certainly a greater threat to public health. In the Diamond Princess, the quarantine didn't work. a full quarantine tires the system out. So far, I feel pretty good about the quarantine. We have been in lockdown for we're a little over 3 weeks now, and I'm not feeling the effects. I'm getting food delivered to us. We're having plenty of fun giving talks and listening to talks. But I don't know how long, I don't know how long my system or anybody else's system is going to last on a full quarantine. A partial quarantine can be continued much longer because you're not in jail, so to speak, in your home. And so I am proposing this morning, or others have proposed this, I'm just kind of going along with this. What are two possible mitigation proposals so that we can get both the health effects and avoid the economic effects? Because I think sooner or later that's got to be discussed. I don't think we can be 100% quarantine into August and a cratered economy and say that was we shouldn't discuss them at least. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Sweden's approach, where basically they're allowing the under 60-year-olds to still go to stores, still go to work. They're developing what's called a herd immunity. That is, those people may in fact catch it just like you would catch the flu, but it's going to be fairly mild for most, and they're the under 16 who do not have a morbidity, that is a indicator that would say that they're high, even though they're under 60, they are still at high risk. And they're going to let the group get immunities. We don't have a vaccine. A vaccine is essentially giving you immunity, an injected immunity by injecting weakened virus cells into you. And you can get the same immunity by going out and catching a mild version of it, and then that's an acquired immunity. It's sort of like getting a vaccine. And so that's Sweden's approach. Or we can use China's approach of detection and location monitoring for the infected people and their contacts. And I'm going to propose a combination of those two. So here's Sweden a week ago on April 1st. We're in deep lockdown. They're only isolating the most vulnerable and the older people. They're keeping preschool and grade schools open. They did close the high schools and colleges. They're allowing bars and restaurants to be open, but you must be seated in 6-foot separation, except for a couple pair. And the parks and the shops are open, so there isn't the economic, all these small businesses aren't going bankrupt. And they're limiting groups to 50 people. I would not have done that. I would have done 10 or 20 people, with a possible exception of schoolrooms. And they maintain open borders. People can come and leave. So they still have, in theory, tourist trade. The partial immunity generates this herd immunity, acquired immunity more quickly. And the precedent of that is that before attending many schools in many states, you must have vaccines. I know that's controversial in a few states, but what it does is a few people who are unable to take a vaccine, like people who have a compromised immune system because they're on chemotherapy or they have some medical issue, by getting 90% of the people vaccinated, you prevent the illness from catching hold and therefore perhaps infecting the people who, for medical reasons, cannot take a vaccine. You would isolate the old, the frail, the sick. Using social distancing, you would keep the young people away from the old, frail, and sick. You would let the young people catch a mild C19 and develop the antibodies. The acquired immunity would reduce the number of people available to the virus to replicate and therefore spread. a pandemic stops mathematically. It stops when each new infected person can infect less than one additional people. Right now, the infection rate is somewhere in the 2.5 to 3.5 rate. Each infected person is infecting 2.5 to 3.5 new people, and there's nothing that prevents one infected person from infecting 100. And I certainly agree that you should lock down the area before you approach the health system's capacity, like New York City's health system capacity has been exceeded, and locking down should have been done earlier if they had projected that. Well, how does this work in practice? Oh, this is from yesterday, and I plotted these out from yesterday. This is the number of confirmed cases per million. The dashed red line is an average flu season. An average flu season results in 1,200 cases per million. Remember, that was from that complicated chart that showed the last 7 flu seasons, and I took the average and divided it into average per million. So this is the average flu season. So where are we today? Well, last week when I showed this chart, the US was right here, right on the average. And a week later, it's up to 1,700. You know, this chart can go a long ways, as it has in Spain and Switzerland and Italy. But what we're asking here hypothetically is, okay, is the Swedish system working or not working? Well, here is Norway with a quarantine similar to the US and about the same, it's hit about the average number. And here's Sweden with a mild quarantine, a non-quarantine of under 60-year-olds who are healthy. And their cases per million, at least as of today. Now, I admit we don't know, you know, what's it going to look like 2 weeks or a month from now? I don't know. But at least right now, it's this alone doesn't say Sweden is wrong. And here's the deaths as of yesterday, the deaths per million. And an average flu season is 106 deaths per million in the United States. So where are we? Well, here in the United States, we haven't hit that number yet. Sweden hasn't hit that number, but it is higher than the US, even though the caseload is lower. And Norway is even lower than the US. I don't know what this one's telling me, but if you're going to get more people infected earlier, if you're going to allow people to get exposed and acquire immunities through getting the virus and getting sick and then getting better, naturally you're going to have more illnesses and more deaths up front. The question, the real ultimate test for this is, where are these graphs at the end of the coronavirus? When we declare it over with, where are these graphs going to be? And we don't know. And if I'm a politician running for office or want to remain in office, where am I going to be in this? Definitely 100% quarantine. You cannot be yelled at. You cannot be accused of being a bad politician. You have much better chance of getting yourself reelected, which is your #1 goal in life. Everybody in politics is going to tell you 100% quarantine because they aren't taking any risk. Sweden is taking a real political risk. But the question is not, is this number higher than the US in a number per million today? The question is, a year and a half from now, when the season is over and we look back at this thing, was Sweden's total here and the US total here or here? And we don't know. You're really taking a chance buying into this, but this is I'm just trying to get both sides of the story. So how would this possibly work? Well, we already have enough information from CDC to know that people over age 60 should be put in what I'm going to call the yellow class, green, yellow, red. They should be the yellow class. They should not be allowed to go out, but they're not. Red is infected. Green is okay to go out and mix. And yellow is you're not allowed to go out. You've got to stay in quarantine. So over 60, you should be in the yellow class because of these higher rates of death if you catch it. These rates for under 60 don't look too bad. I mean, you could argue you could make it under 50, but let's say I'm going to argue for under 60. Okay, then I'm going to throw into that also, if you're under 50 or under 60 and you have one or more of these conditions, which increase your risk by a factor of at least 5, you should also be in the yellow class. So if you're under 50 and you're a smoker, you're in the yellow class. Or if you have any of these underlying conditions. Now, for the people who are under 60 and they're floating around out there in the malls and the schools and everything, at the entrance to all the malls and all the schools and all the airports and any place, you would have a thermal scanner, which is scanning their body temperature. And see how this one has an elevated temperature? You pull them out and you go and you do a direct forehead test. And this person is, the person who's showing up here and is verified by here is, their status has changed from green to yellow. They are not allowed entrance to school or wherever, church or wherever, people are serious about their church. I wouldn't allow churches, but anyhow, schools or businesses or restaurants, you've got to pass this test and you've got to be identified as green before you are allowed entrance into that area. If you test high, your status is electronically changed on your cell phone. Everybody must carry a smartphone. Anybody who wants to have freedom has to carry a smartphone that has a program on it that is identifying them, and the person who is monitoring this has the ability to instantly change their status from green to yellow. And yellow means that you got to go on. If yellow and under 60 means that if you want to continue to go out, you got to go and have a formal advanced test done, either an antibody test or a virus test done. So, okay, now you're identified, and you're identified by red, green, or yellow. And if you go out back here, you go out and you do this more advanced test, and they find yes, you do have it. Now your status has changed from yellow to red, obviously. So now how does this all work? Well, if you are now identified as having a red status, both Apple and Google, who do not normally play well together, have gotten together, and they last Friday came up with a plan that they can track everybody's status through their phone, the Android or iPhone. And the way it would work is that if you're out here talking with somebody and you're maintaining your 6-foot distance, and then sometime later the guy comes down with the flu, and so it goes through this lock and key system, and that's all vaulted here. And then the girl he was talking with is notified by her cell phone that she has been exposed. Doesn't tell who the person was, but that someone on such and such a day, and maybe even the hour of that day, is told to the person, and that she should go into a 7-day lockdown herself and be formally tested. And this can all be done through the Apple, Google smartphone plan system, and they can get this up and running in the matter of weeks, maybe a couple months, but I would think that they could do it in weeks. Their problem is that this violates privacy law, and that's the big issue here. So I said, well, how would this work for me? So I took a week ago. I did nothing. This is just my carrying my cell phone in my pocket while I do a walk around the neighborhood, or I went around the loop twice. I live next to Eckerd College. This is Eckerd College over here. This is the entrance off 54th Street to Eckerd College. Went out of my home and walked around the path a couple times. And this is the cell phone. This is not me doing anything. This is me afterwards looking, well, what did I do back on last Sunday? And this is what I walked around. And these points perhaps are recorded more precisely than are shown here, but the time and date are all recorded. And if I stopped and talked with my friend Gene over here, his cell phone is going to show that he stopped in the same location at the same time, and now the phone systems can tell each other that Gene, you got exposed to somebody who is a certified C-19 infected person on such a day, and you should go into quarantine. Otherwise, until you get that, you've got a green card. What Google is doing is they're doing this by Bluetooth. That is, they're proposing that all cell phones have a Bluetooth, and what they're doing is they're detecting Bluetooth, anybody who has a Bluetooth, and recording that, anybody who has a Bluetooth connection that would generally be less than 30 feet. They claim Bluetooth works for 30 feet. I could never get it to work for 30 feet in my place. I'd say it's more in 10 or 15 feet. Anytime you get a wall between you, it goes, it really knocks it down. But Bluetooth would be a way to identify it. This method is cell phone cellular GPS data. And I think I like this one better than the Bluetooth one, but either way, either method works. And so then you get all this stuff done, and you test the contacts, and anybody who tests bad, you move them to yellow status if they've been exposed, and they either go back to green status or up to red status if after a more formal test. If you are on a yellow status, that is, you've got to stay home for a week or so. You get a subsidy, sick leave subsidy, paid for out of this new CARE Act. So here's the end discussion, and it looks like we're gonna have over 15 minutes for it. So, do people agree that there is a health and suffering impact from high unemployment? That is, crashing the economy may not be the smartest thing to do. We certainly must prevent the health system to be overwhelmed, even if we have to crash the economy. I don't have problems with that. But how might we restart the economy below overwhelm? And I don't hear anybody talking about that. When are we going to restart this? And as I pointed out earlier, the better the quarantine works, the longer it is before you can do the restart. Freedom would require you to have this new C-19 smartphone app on your smartphone, and you've got to be carrying your smartphone so we can record your location and at all times, location and time, so it can do a cross check on you. You would issue those to anybody under 60 who don't have otherwise health conditions, or anybody who's had C-19 but has been through an antibody test and a virus test has shown that they no longer are infective. And you would scan everybody's temperature before work, school, mall entry, any entry to any building. You'd be doing this group scan and then an individual scan for temperature. Anybody who fails that test would get a yellow status until they pass the more advanced tests. Passing the advanced tests or having gotten C-19 and the antibodies gives you back green status, and that the law that just got passed that gave a lot of money to unemployment, that's used to pay for people's voluntary quarantine. Anybody who is yellow goes into yellow status from green status gets paid up to 14 days of quarantine. And that you would track all this stuff. But of course, you got the question of, would we tolerate the loss of privacy? The way China did it is China already had a surveillance system, 500,000 cameras that automatically do facial recognition, and I'm sure cell phone monitoring in China. I'm sure people in China don't have any privacy already. We're proposing something that would put the U.S. citizen who wants to go out. I mean, if you don't want to do it, if you don't want to lose your privacy, you got to stay in quarantine. If you're willing to lose your privacy, you can go out.
We have two people with their hands raised. The first is going to be Michael.
So just a quick comment. I know there's a lot of people who've typed questions or comments on chat. I'm impressed with South Korea's ability to do what they've done. I don't, for the first moment in my life, think that we can absolutely mirror it because of different characteristics of our culture and government. But if it was me, I would be trying to follow the way they did things. Because if you look at the data, as unreliable it possibly could be, they seem to be at the bottom of the bad things and near the top of the good things in all the different aspects that you've covered during your excellent talk. And
yeah, I'm trying to find that.
Throw it out there as my opinion. I think that we need to do a very smart, staged quarantine relaxation. Once we have the ability to get more accurate testing, both for those who are positive and shedding virus, as well as those who are theoretically immune for a while because the antibodies have been produced and they test positive for antibodies. Having said all that, I'll leave everybody with one final fly in the ointment. Just in the last day or two, South Korea has announced that some of the people who have cleared every hurdle, digitally, Bluetooth, you name it, they're out and about, they are getting sick again. They're becoming symptomatic again. I'm not sure what that means, but that's certainly not something that anybody would want to hear about. But unless the reports are false, that's also happening now. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Yes, and I think the increased number of cases in South Korea, I also have read that South Korea had the big advantage of it had SARS in 2003, and therefore, and it was serious in South Korea, and therefore they invested the money that was needed to, when the next pandemic came around, and we all know it's going to happen. We all knew it was going to happen, and they were better prepared for it than most countries in the world. As soon as you allow the quarantine to stop and people go to start to try to get that green group to start to mingle with each other, you are absolutely going to increase the number of cases and the number of deaths. The question is, a year and a half from now, when we look back at it and we have all the data in, yes, you had an increase, but was the total number lower or higher than those countries that had a total lockdown? And we just don't know the answer to that. And again, from a politician standpoint, you've got to go with 100% lockdown. It's going to be the grassroots people that are going to say, no, whoa, there could be a little economic problem here too, or a big economic problem, and a tired problem. So thank you. Appreciate your question.
Sure. This is the ultimate risk-benefit ratio quandary we're in. Without 100% reliable and valid data. I wouldn't
You
want to
named
have
it.
to make that decision.
You named it, and it's going to have to come from the people because the politicians will not have guts enough to do this. That's what I was trying to do today, is explain the both sides of the issue.
I just first thank you, Peter. I think we all realize that this is going to be an economic disaster, and I think you really deserve to be complimented on thinking about this so carefully and coming up with a really well thought out program for how we might proceed. And so I do thank you. The comments I had were first what was just said about the fly in the ointment, about the cases, about evidently this morning there was more news about people who had recovered from the COVID-19 infection and are now have become reinfected or got sick again, or whatever it is. The other was, so that was one. The other was, of course, your chart about the cases per, the cases in different countries, the number of cases. We have to recognize that that chart is highly inaccurate based on the fact that we don't know who's being tested and how many
Yes,
tests have been done and how good they are. And so
testing is highly flawed.
Mad, yeah. And I presume the other thing was, I presume you had a red category. You had the green, the yellow, and what was the red?
Red, yeah, red were people that were
Okay.
certified. Got it.
Right. So fitting into the red category, both for pre-existing condition and age, what does the future look like?
Well, the red category is that you've got it, you have not recovered it, and you have not yet recovered, and assuming
No,
that
I mean, somebody who's not been exposed. I mean, in terms of someone who's in a high risk category by age and pre-existing disease. In terms of quarantine.
Your yellow category, if you're high risk or have other illnesses that make catching this very dangerous, you're in the yellow category. You either start in the green or the yellow category. Once you've been taken a test and it is known that you have C19, then you are put into the red category. And then the red category goes through the contact tracing system to inform all other people that they have in fact been exposed to a red person that is a carrier, a known carrier.
Thank you.
If you make a few assumptions here and decide to go with the statistics, if we had universal testing, besides what you can monitor people by temperature, use the new Abbott system where you get a result in 15 minutes. You can then divide the population into those that have been exposed to the virus and those that have not.
Yes.
You already have the hospital records and all that kind of thing, that people that are contagious or were contagious. But there's probably 5 times the number of people that have been exposed to the virus that do not appear in current testing, because you're only testing when you get symptoms. So that would mean if you could divide the population, that you would know who was immune and who was not immune, and therefore a candidate for being infected, and then allow volunteer distancing by those people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bob. That's good. Yeah.
And accept the result then. You know, it's eventually you're going to have a trade-off, and you're going to use the statistics to decide what you're going to do.
Yeah, there really needs to be 2 kinds of testing. The Abbott lab one is a DNA test for the virus, that you actually have the virus in your body. And so that would mean that, and you may or may not know it, and you may or may not be mildly sick, not sick at all, or very sick, but you've actually got that virus in your body to the extent where it can be tested. And it uses a method called PCR to amplify the virus's DNA and then measure it. And yes, if you've got it, it detects you in 5 minutes. If you don't have it, it has to amplify it for a longer period of time, and that takes 13 minutes. The antibody test is a test whether you have had it and your body has produced antibodies to it. And of course, we don't know what antibodies are being produced by this virus yet, and we don't yet have an antibody test for it. But I know that 60 different companies are working on this.
Just a couple of questions, if you're okay, Peter. One says, would the proposed system mean those of us over 60 would have to remain quarantined for another year or so? Would we be allowed to go out for exercise? And have you heard of any government in US willing to let people under 60 out of quarantine?
No, I have not. No, I don't know any place in the United States where any remote version of this system is being proposed. It clearly is working. It clearly is active in Sweden. How do we get people that are over 60 out of the mess? I would say that first you want to develop herd immunity, so that the number of people who might expose you to the virus are way down. And herd immunity, again, thinking of polio or any of these viruses that are out there, measles, that people have. Measles used to kill 500,000 people a year in the United States. Then they developed the vaccine for it, and it dropped basically to zero. How and why? Well, back when it was doing 500,000 people, if a kid went into school and had the beginnings of measles, didn't know it themselves, and spread it to all their classmates, and then by the time they know they got measles, they spread it to half a dozen other people. What we need to do is have a system that somehow stops that. So one way is vaccines. If you have a vaccine, what happens is you spread it to half a dozen people, but most of them, 90% of them, have antibodies and they are not infected. Yes, they're exposed, but they're not infected. And if you allow herd immunity to develop, then you're essentially vaccinating everybody. That's what I was hoping that's what I'm hoping to propose here. Did I answer that question?
I've got one more quick one. How do we get our government to temporarily change privacy laws to implement the Google Apple app?
Google and Apple are going ahead, and they're co-writing this application with or without government approval, and they're hoping that the government will give them the necessary privacy law exemption by the time they finished writing the app and get it up and running. Prior to that, I guess each person on an individual basis could always sign a release or waiver. In fact, anytime I go on the internet and sign and download some new program, I don't know what I'm signing away. I suspect I'm signing away my privacy. So I don't know if it's all that much different than most of the programs we're downloading today, that where you waive, that you acknowledge that there is a privacy law, that you are eligible for that privacy law, and that you are waiving your rights to that privacy law. I don't know how, but this is also new, and my problem. And the other day, a week ago, I was working with, well, couldn't we develop a smell test? And then I worked on that for a few days, and it's not going to work. Is it accurate? Yeah, but can I implement it? Can I come up with some quick way to do that? No. This is a quick way we could do it. And yes, we're going to lose some privacy if you sign in. Otherwise, you stay home. You can always opt to stay home.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate this.
We look forward to seeing everyone next week.